You're listening to The Corbett Report. CorbettReport.com.
Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report podcast, and specifically that subsection of the podcast known as Questions for Corbett. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, coming to you, as always, from the sunny climes of Western Japan, here on this 4th day of August, 2014. As I say, this is Questions for Corbett, and it has been a while since our last one. Again, this was not something that was planned. It was just one of those things that happened. As I'm sure you know by now, my computer gave up the ghost a few weeks ago, so I had to get it repaired. So I was on a bit of an enforced vacation, and everything got sent a little bit further back than what I had intended. But here we are back with a Questions for Corbett, and from this point on, all things being equal, there should be a new podcast coming out from CorbettReport.com every Monday, whether that be Questions for Corbett, or whether that be Film Literature in the New World Order, or whether that be the regular podcast series. At least that is the intention, and let's hope that that happens. As I say, this is Questions for Corbett, where exactly as it says on the tin, you write in your questions and I answer them. And there are different ways to get your questions in. As always, you can use the contact form on CorbettReport.com to leave a text message. You can also record yourself using the new SpeakPipe application. You can record an audio message, which I will play on the podcast, and we have a few examples of that this month. We also, of course, accept your YouTube responses or your Twitter questions. Again, just use the hashtag QFC. And also, in addition, there's another way to get in touch these days. In fact, one that will get priority. That is to leave a question in the comment section of CorbettReport.com. Of course, for members of CorbettReport.com, you can log in and leave your question for Corbett directly on the website, and I will do my best to try to answer those. So again, many, many different ways to get your question in. And as a result, there are many, many, many questions that come in on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. So again, there's been a lot of questions that have come in since the last episode of this Questions for Corbett, and I cannot get all of them in, I cannot answer them all in this one podcast. So, as always, please accept my apologies if your question did not get answered. It is not personal. It's just we cannot physically answer them all. So here we go. We're going to open up the mailbag and get into the questions. And since the last time we had a Questions for Corbett, of course, we have seen the release of the Federal Reserve documentary. Yes, the much ballyhooed Federal Reserve documentary that I've spent several months making. So there have been quite a few questions about the Federal Reserve that have come in the last few weeks. So let's answer some of those first up and right off the bat. We're going to start with a regular email that came in from Bob, who asked, could we air your Fed documentary on our local access TV channel? Well, I replied directly to Bob to answer this, but I'll answer this here in the open forum here as well, to say absolutely yes. In fact, it's wonderful to see people with that idea. I think this is a great and perhaps often overlooked tool for info warriors out there to get this information out to others. Access TV, of course, public access is a great way of getting some of these ideas out, because of course most public access will allow you to help take part in their programming, and will perhaps potentially allow you to, for example, air a documentary, assuming, of course, you have the right to air that documentary, on subjects like the Federal Reserve or what have you. So an excellent tool to use generally, and of course, in this specific case with the Federal Reserve documentary, of course, you have my blessing to play it on local access TV or wherever else that you can get it played. Of course, 100%, the answer is yes. And this is an answer to another question that I get quite a lot from people who want to support the work in the Federal Reserve documentary but don't have the money to buy a DVD, or they want to do something different than just buying a DVD. Of course, I really do appreciate your monetary support with DVD purchases. It really does help to make this work possible, and it makes future documentaries possible. But more than that, of course, there are things that you can do that don't involve any money whatsoever that can help me out. Not only, for example, playing this on Access TV or helping to mirror or spread the link around to people in your contact list or what have you, but also some other ideas. I do need translation help. Of course, the entire transcript for the entire documentary is up on CorbettReport.com/Federal Reserve. So it's all there. If you do speak another language and you do want to put in the effort to help translate this, please do so, and I will make that translation available through the website or on the YouTube video or in whatever form seems best. depending on the way that you provide the translation. That's going to be helpful. In fact, we already have a couple of people working behind the scenes on creating a German translation of the documentary, so hopefully that will be available in the near future. Other languages would be helpful. Please get in touch with me and we'll coordinate just to make sure that no one's duplicating anyone else's work. Some other ideas, of course, you can... here's an idea that if you implement this, it'll take 90 seconds out of your day, but it'll genuinely really help me out. If you have a favorite media host out there, please just drop them a line just to say, hey, I heard James Corbett is available for interviews on his new Federal Reserve documentary. I suggest you check it out. Just something like that. Just a nice, pleasant little note to suggest having me on as a guest, and that can really make a difference. So, again, whatever media hosts you listen to, please write in and ask them to have me on. I'm happy to talk about this documentary anywhere that will have me on to talk about it. So that's just another idea. So lots of different ways that you can help out with this work, and if you want to help spread the information that has been contained in this documentary. All right, let's move on to the next question. This one, a SpeakPipe message that came in from Jennifer.
Hi, James. This is Jennifer from California. You had mentioned in one of your interviews that one of the most important factors of freeing ourselves from the financial system is getting out of debt. I was wondering, for your questions to Corbett, whether you could expand a little bit on that and what that means in terms of how the banks can continue to control us through debt after the financial system crashes and the dollar is completely devalued. Thanks a lot.
All right, Jennifer, thank you very much for that question. I do appreciate it. And it is a good question because it raises an important issue, something that I've talked about many times, the idea of debt itself as being the type of chains of enslavement referred to in the title of the documentary, Century of Enslavement, that we are tied to the bankers through these debt chains that enforce us, obligate us to work 10, 20, 30, 40 years of our life to pay off our auto loans and credit cards and mortgage debt and all of these other forms of debt that we go into in order to obviously get the goods that we want, but more importantly, from the macroeconomic point of view, to create the money itself, which most of it is created through debt to the bankers. Again, a great system if you're a banker. And this is, of course, a problem because in times of economic crises where the currency becomes debased and devalued and they have to switch over to a new system, of course they can suddenly have a bank holiday and suddenly revalue the dollar, and new dollars will be worth whatever 10 of the old dollars, so that suddenly your entire bank account will be reduced by 90% overnight. That type of thing is certainly possible in the type of economic collapse scenario that I think is in the cards at some point, or is at least one of the cards in the deck that the bankers can use when they do seek to finally take over this system completely. And in such a system, of course, if you have a large debt, it will obviously be revalued into the new dollars as well, as will your bank account, and suddenly you'll be earning new dollars, so that ultimately you will be in either the same position or potentially in an even worse position than you were before. And the prospect of debtor prison is something that we associate with some sort of 19th century Dickensian type of Victorian era type of idea, but it is something that more and more is likely to occur in the event of some sort of economic collapse, where literally the debt chains, the debt enslavement becomes quite literal, and people are once again thrown into forced servitude in some sort of debtor prison to work off their debts to the banks. Again, that is a possibility. I'm not saying that's going to happen overnight, but I'm saying it certainly could happen in the event of the economic collapse that we do see in the cards, or at least as one of the cards in the deck. Now, this is not to say that all debt or all the idea of credit itself is necessarily evil. It really does depend how it's done and by whom and for what purpose and in what way. And there are alternative monetary systems that are predicated on the idea of money created through credit, but that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with bankers and debt obligations of that sort. It could be a mutual credit system or even self-issued credit, as Paul Grignon has argued for, and as I always like to try to point people towards, because I think it's a pretty ingenious system that he's come up with. So I'll put some links in the show notes to do with those alternative monetary systems that also rely on some sort of credit creation process process so that the economy can expand when it needs to, which I think is an important part of any economic system. So again, this isn't to say that debt itself is a bad idea, but the debt that we have today, where we pay bankers for the privilege of creating our money out of nothing, or out of our obligation to pay back to them, more importantly, is a pretty untenable system, and one that we really shouldn't allow to continue. All right, moving along, we have a question in from Raga Daga, who writes, I am currently reading Secrets of the Temple, How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country by William Grader. So far, I've learned that the Fed is granted not only the authority to create new money by the issuance of interest-bearing loans out of nothing, but also the authority to destroy money when these loans are repaid. Do you know of any instances when the Fed has actually destroyed money, or maybe a ratio of the money destroyed versus money created? All right, thank you very much for that, Ragadaga. That is a good question because, again, this is an important concept to understand, and it's really not so complicated. As I hope people are more aware these days, the Federal Reserve helps to expand the monetary supply by creating money and injecting it into the reserve accounts of various banks through their Federal Open Market Committee, which decides on whether to buy or sell treasuries in the open market from whoever is buying or selling, and putting the funds into, or taking the funds out of, the reserve accounts of the banks through which those treasuries are bought and sold. So by putting those funds in or taking those funds out, they can literally put money into the economy, into the monetary supply, or to take it out. And the Federal Reserve can do that at any time, just based on whether it's going to be buying or selling treasuries in order to inflate or contract the money supply. Perhaps more importantly, just as the greater share of the money supply is created by just the regular commercial banks in their everyday lending operations, so too the regular commercial banks have the ability to take money out of the economy by simply retiring loans. Calling in loans and failing to issue new loans means that they'll be contracting the money supply, because again, the money is created as debt. As that debt is retired, the money supply itself shrinks. So that is the way that money expands or contracts in the economy, and yes, it certainly has contracted in the past. It has been destroyed, and one of the most notable examples was the Great Contraction. That is not my term for it, it's Milton Friedman's description of the 1929 to 1933 contraction of the money supply. I believe it was by almost 1/3 of the money supply of the United States evaporated away as banks started to fold, as they called in loans, as they tightened credit, and basically the entire economy started to contract. The Federal Reserve made that even worse because in a pre-Federal Reserve system, the other banks, the stronger banks, at least had some sort of incentive to try to save, to band together to try to save some of the smaller institutions. Of course, they got to decide which ones lived and which ones died, but at any rate, they had some interest in saving the financial system itself, so they would band together in that. But in the Federal Reserve System, suddenly there was this idea that, well, this is everyone's kind of tied to the system, and it's the system that's keeping us all afloat. So, as Friedman pointed out, the Federal Reserve definitely exacerbated the Great Contraction of the 29 to 33 period, which was the heart of the Depression. That's why the Depression really happened, and what really got it underway in earnest. It wasn't the crash itself, the 1929 crash. It was the contraction of the money supply that was the real problem at the time. And that's why, as I include in the documentary, there's that quote from Bernanke at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday. Yes, you said that the Federal Reserve created or caused the Great Depression. Well, you're right, but we won't do it again. What a wonderful statement to make. But there you go. So that's what that was all about. The money supply can and does contract because money can be destroyed.